right, welcome everyone. My name is Abdi Kazimipur. I'm in the Department of Sociology here at the university. It's my pleasure to be introducing my colleague, Dr. Trevor Harrison. But before I do that, there are a couple of housekeeping announcements that I have to share with you. There is another talk in this brown bag series that is scheduled for April the 3rd, and the title of that talk is Youth Bulge in Selected Asian Populations, Gender, Migration, and Development by Dr. Glenda Bonifacio, who is not here today. All right, so that is something that you can also find on the Prentice website, and I suppose you will receive numerous emails reminders about that. There is also a list that you can put your name and email address on in case you want to be notified about all the future developments. So I start from here. All right, with that, this is an event that is held, I guess, once a month by Prentice, almost, about that. And the title of the talk today is A Tale of Two Global Cities, London, New York, and the Rise of Financial Capital. The presenter is not a stranger to this forum. He's a frequent contributor to this talk series, Dr. Trevor Harrison, professor of sociology, my great colleague in the department. Trevor is an affiliate of the Prentice Institute, actually an associate director of the institute, and as a kind of side hobby, he also directs another institute, the Part-Time Institute, which is operating from Edmonton. Trevor has been wearing so many different hats, so besides these two institutes that he's involved in, he has been doing all sorts of research on sort of very wide range of topics. He has been spending some time recently in Greece, and he has been writing on the different aspects of the economic crisis in that country. So Trevor has this unique ability, some may call it sort of a strange habit, that if he spends more than 2 months somewhere, a book will come out, has to come out about it. So when I don't see him for a couple of months, I get a little nervous. So, and I think the talk that he will have today is somewhat related to also a trip that he had south of the border as a Fulbright visiting scholar, and I had a researcher that had to be spent in one of the American universities, educating our American friends about Canada, making them realize that there is more to Canada than a place with lots of snow and lots of taxes to pay. So, because this is just the beginning, I suppose, of a project that will end up in a book sometime soon. So without any further ado, I would like to just ask you to please join me welcoming Trevor. And I just want to mention, I guess one of the notes that I have is saying that Trevor is currently going through some kind of identity crisis. He cannot decide which one of his two passions he should put first, Canadian politics or Canadian art. So, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much, Abdi, for a thoroughly unique introduction, as I would expect. It's interesting, Abdi says, and about could this end up being a book. What I'm going to try to do here actually is condense something. I'll give a little brief history kind of this. Over the last few years, and having traveled a bit and been to various fairly large cities, the Japan Exchange being in Tokyo is certainly one of those cities, that I got really interested in the fact that so many people, we're an urbanized world now, and you have these kind of major cities that stand out. And so in the back of my mind, I was trying to think, how does this actually fit in terms of globalization and all that? And so this idea was kind of rocketing through my head for a couple of years. And then I think it was probably early last year or so, while I was at the gym, I bumped into Chris Kikucha here in the political science department. And we're chatting about things. And he mentions that he and a colleague at the University of Calgary, Greg Anderson, are putting together a textbook for Oxford on international political economy. And so in the course of just talking with Chris, I said, well, I have this idea, actually. I've been sort of wondering about the role of kind of global cities. And I knew there's kind of a literature around that already, but the importance of all these global cities and a whole discussion about global cities generally. And would you be interested in me writing a chapter for this book? So he says, okay, sure. So that started me on this this path, which is not actually unusual, it seems to me, for a lot of academics, that we start off kind of going this way, and then as you get further and further in the research, you realize that kind of what you started to research is not exactly where you end up, and it keeps taking you into bodies of literature that and stuff that you just couldn't imagine. So it ended up being really fascinating. And at the end of the day, they were very kind. They said, actually, well, the limit for words for the chapters should be about 9,000 words. And I kept increasing it, and it'd be 16, 17,000, how to cut it back again, and then add, and then cut back. This thing could easily have been 20,000 words. And to Abdi's point, it actually is sort of the topic that could well end up being a book. No promises, but it is the kind of topic there it could be. And so what I end up doing is, from starting to look at just global cities in general, I suddenly started to realize that there's two cities in particular that seem to be especially important historically and currently in terms of the rise of finance capital. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the day. So a lot of conventional political economy, and even much of the discussion on globalization, centers very much on kind of the nation state. With globalization, of course, there has, however, been some discussion of is the nation state going to dissolve, the withering away of the state, or are states becoming simply more complex in the way they organize economic matters, or is power just moving to transnational corporations? And in turn, does this mean that the importance of NGOs, non-state actors, in terms of issues of governance? But part of this whole discussion, a subset of this, was this interest in global cities that has really arisen over the last 30 years or so. And some of this I'm going to go through really quickly here, but as a sociologist, it also is a fascinating topic because to a large extent, sociology begins in the 19th century to answer some very specific questions of the time. One is as all the early sociologists were addressing, was the move from a traditional to a modern society. What does modernity mean? And as part of that movement to a modern society was the notion that, in some sense, we're moving from being rural, agrarian, agricultural societies to becoming urban and industrial. It didn't happen all at once, and of course, to a large extent, we still remained quite rural up until early part of the 20th century. Some parts of the world actually up until the last few decades. But this was very much at the heart of early discussions in sociology. So again, many of these people they've listed here and others very much address the whole idea of urbanization. One of the most influential schools in North America, of course, is the Chicago School, beginning particularly at the end of the First World War, coming out of Park and Burgess and other theorists there. Discussions about urban sociology and the ecology movement. So there's a whole kind of notion of geographical space. Much of the argument at the time was that centered also around social disorganization theory, which influenced a whole set of different things in terms of urban planning, discussions of deviance, crime, and other things. In the 1960s, again, very much coming out of the United States, but to some extent influenced by European currents, you had the rise of something called New Urban Sociology, which really was quite interdisciplinary. So there's a lot of the people who worked on this were geographers, sociologists, economists, and tried to bring together a kind of different understanding of the nature of cities. Part of the new urban sociology, again, was a smaller subset of this discussion of global cities that began to arise in the late 1970s. A couple of major people involved in this discussion were John Friedman, who as described here, suggested that, or defined them as a class of cities that play a leading role in the spatial articulation of the global economic system. And Saskia Sassen, who has written any number of books on this topic, talking about a network of global cities that coordinate capital flows. As Friedman and Sassen in particular, but others have talked about, the idea here is that you have these cities that they function to organize and control finance around the globe, but there's a few very particular nodal cities in this, New York, London, and Tokyo. But as I will shortly get to here, in fact, Tokyo ends up kind of discarded as one of these big three. It's really kind of New York and London that are focused on much of the global cities literature or the indexes. Since then, there's been a lot of debate about these indexes and the whole notion of global cities in general. On a kind of somewhat positive note, there's been a discussion again about the devolution of power. Again, is power moving to these large urban entities as opposed to the nation state? And the term globalization has come into common practice. But there's also criticisms of the approach, that it kind of reifies cities as more important than they actually are. That's a kind of quick overview of a background, and I want to move on, as I suggest, much beyond that, because in fact, as I wrote this paper, I got way beyond what I thought I was going to look at. The starting point, in some sense, however, as I had said to Chris, was I was going to look, though, at the global cities indexes, basically, and see what I could find out of that. And there's a whole bunch of them. They're kind of like, I don't know, they're like rabbits. They've just kind of proliferated over the last 30 years. But there's a few fairly significant ones that are quite often referred to. And so these are, I just pulled these out, and in the paper I actually go into somewhat more detail in the appendix about how these are decided on. They have slightly different criteria, but at the end of the day, the really interesting thing, and here's the results from them. These are just the top 10. As you look across these, you'll see that New York and London are always 1 and 2. And so even Tokyo, that is mentioned as being one of the important kind of nodal cities, in some of the indexes drops off. It isn't necessarily number 3 even. So that actually raised a really interesting question for me. So I start off kind of looking at global cities in general, but all of a sudden it's like, well, New York and London don't just look like the others. They look really very particular here. And in fact, when you start to read what Sassen and Friedman and others have to say, they in fact say, yeah, New York and London are not like the other cities. It's not just a matter of actually ranking them here. So you say that they're 1 and 2, and then there's a 3 and a 4 and a 5. No, that 1 and 2 is actually substantially ahead of the other ones. They are that much more important. So it's not just simply ordinal here. They are substantive in terms of the differences. The reason for this is many of the indexes certainly have a financial component to them. Some of the indexes, of course, also have things such as standard of living, cultural things. You know, it's nice to live in a place that has a symphony and, you know, unlike Calgary and Edmonton, a real hockey team. So, those kind of things come into it. But it's really the economic thing that becomes interesting. But the more I got into it, too, I realized that, after all, when you're in any number of cities, sometimes you're not even aware that you're in a big city. So you're in a city of, say, Mexico City. Might be 30 million people or whatever, but you don't know that you're actually surrounded by 30 million people, because you can only kind of know that immediate context, right? And so a city is a city is a city, but what makes these particularly important is a very much smaller part of that city, and that's the financial district. To understand why New York and London then become particularly important is to situate it much more in a kind of historical sense, and to recognize that something has happened in terms of the nature of capital. The separation of finance capital in particular from industrial or productive capital, one being very much national and tied to the territory, the other one from the beginning actually being international and hence also very much more mobile. So let me just see here. I just missed something here. Nope. Okay. So here's a little bit about London. Lots of stuff on demographics here. So what you see is London kind of starts out looking like a lot of other places. It was, even by 1600, the largest city in England. But again, this is largely a rural area, but 50,000 people was a fair chunk. And then suddenly around 1800, it starts to really grow in size. And it's around this time that you develop some distinctions. And this, again, for sociologists becomes really interesting in terms of how we conceive geographical space and the terminology that we actually use from it. And so there's a whole bunch of literature that talks about a whole bunch of different Londons. The City of London, which is the city, the financial district, still known as that. The central area, inner London, the metropolis, etc., etc. And but what you start to see after this time is that the City of London, the city, actually starts to decline in population. So it becomes more important in an economic sense, but it actually declines in terms of its the demographics, even as the rest of the city grows. So you have this kind of interesting separation going on. And here's a short little map of it. So there's the city and the city, which is an interesting kind of distinction. So, because as most of us tend to at times write much better than you can just extemporaneously speak it, I'm going to read a little bit at times here from this chapter to make it a little more clear. The splitting off of the financial district from Greater London is not entirely different from that which occurred in other large cities. The particular relationship of the city and the city to the English state requires at least passing comment, however. The few world cities that arose early on in human history in Europe and elsewhere were places of trade and protection, a few of which became city-states. The development of city-states was an uneven and differentiated process, however, hindered in part by continuous wars that, as in Greece, preserved their autonomy, but also slowed the development of larger geographic states. Nonetheless, some city-states, notably in Italy, expanded outwards during the 11th century in efforts to secure food, supplies, and trade, a process of expansion that occurred much later in the cities of Northern Europe, though these cities did exercise considerable economic influence over their surrounding territories, and often formed military and trade alliances between cities, such as the Hanseatic League. The next 2 centuries saw proto-capitalism emerge in several cities, including Amsterdam and Bruges, but as Brodel argues, the result remained essentially city-centered economies. Only in the 7th century did the modern European state emerge, based on a territorial economy, no more so than in England. Why was this the case? While the causes of the English Revolution, alternatively the civil wars, of the 17th century remain disputed, there's little doubt that these events coincided and to some degree resulted in a series of political, economic, ideological, and social changes that paved the way for modern capitalism. Politically, the revolution established the rights of property, and not inconsequentially, the political rights of the propertied. In other words, as Skocpol notes, it was a bourgeois revolution that did not transform England's class and social structures, but instead, quotes, furthered social economic development, end of quotes, along lines commensurate with the interests of a nascent capitalist class made up of aristocratic landowners, industrialists, and merchants. Economically, the new bourgeois order benefited from the start of the Industrial Revolution, begun the following century, a development in which England faced few competitors, just world trade promoted through both diplomacy and the British Navy, the latter given ideological justification by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Socioculturally, the period following the English Revolution also witnessed a series of related changes, including increased urbanization and the rise of new class formations, notably an urban proletariat that replaced, though not wholly, agrarians and craft workers. Yet while the other European cities, even those that became capitals, were embedded within the national territorial states, London retained its autonomy, even as it became the center of a strong centralized state. Inwood notes that, quotes, "For centuries, governments have feared the size and power of London and tried to develop policies to minimize the city's threat to authority and order," end of quotes. Why did London become so dominant within the British realm? First, London was the capital, a political advantage that it used over any other city. Second, it was overwhelmingly the largest city on the Isles. Unlike Europe, it had few competitors in terms of population. As noted earlier, London's population in 1800 was 861,000. The second largest city in Britain was Dublin, with a population of 165,000. Third, it also had geographical advantages, notably the Thames River and the port system that made London a conduit of goods, services, people, and money, both entering and leaving the country. But it was not simply London that dominated England and the United Kingdom, but more specifically the city, whose primary power was financial. This circumstance, too, requires explanation. In the early days of capitalism, industrialists, merchants, and bankers, though perhaps personally competitive, were not structurally at odds. Over time, however, fault lines appeared between big and small capitalists, and more especially between industrial capitalists in coalition with provincial elites and landed interests, and finance capitalists, the former being more inclined to protectionism, the latter to laissez-faire policies. The political expression of this fracture and of finance capital's subtle elevation over industry within the state was Britain's abandonment of mercantilism and gradual adoption of the free trade policies in the first part of the 19th century. But the geographic expression of finance capitalism's growing might was the City of London, whose wealth had already increased markedly as a result of the revolutions of the late 18th century and the continuing political uncertainty that marked the following century. The city, itself protected by the British Empire, offered a safe haven for wealth at a time when the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic Wars were threatening the privileged classes throughout Europe. The city embraced three interrelated elements of finance capital: insurance, centered on Lloyd's of London; market exchanges, regulated primarily through the London Stock Exchange; and banking, the Bank of England. London continues to be then not the sole, but an important part of the structure of emerging capitalism throughout the rest of the 19th century. But towards the beginning of the 20th century, there begins to be a shift, or the creation of a kind of ally and competitor in the control of finance capital, and that is New York. At the beginning of the First World War, London is still very much at the heart of world capitalism. Zurich and some other cities are also important, but its importance is beginning to decline for a number of reasons. And again, just quoting briefly here from a section in the paper. London, more accurately, the City of London, thus became by the late 19th century the undisputed center of the new international order of global capitalism. Quote from Pliny here. Through its political power within the British state, the city, the clearinghouse of international finance and the source of sterling as the world's currency, according to McMichael, fashioned the conditions necessary for the creation of an open world market that was monetarily stable during the period of 1875 to 1914, albeit politically quite unstable as subsequent events showed. Though centered in London, the city financiers operated outside Europe and the USA, particularly in the Empire, South America, the Middle and Far East, fostering the movement of commodities around the globe. There were, of course, other sites important to the network: Paris, Berlin, New York, and Boston, as well as others emergent, such as Tokyo. But none stood taller than London, and within its landscape, the city, protected by geography, political and military power, and the benefits of being the earliest capitalist country. As the First World War began, the city of London remained high among cities that Polanyi termed the brain centers of world capitalism. But its relative importance at the head of international finance was already in decline, a decline accentuated by the war that followed and growing competition with other financial centers, especially New York. Indeed, both symbolically and practically, the war signaled the transfer of empire and role as chief protector of global capitalism from the United Kingdom to the United States. Before the war, American capitalists were content to expand their influence in London. After the war, they took steps to make New York the world's financial center. The empire's embers, though diminished, continued to glow, however. Indeed, they can still be seen today in the creation of creative use of financial instruments, crafted to meet the letter, if not the spirit of the law, in the entrenchment of Greenwich Mean Time, by which London is the starting point for every trading day, with New York close behind, and in the widespread use of English as the lingua franca of international business, by which the torch of Anglo-financial dominance could so easily be passed to its former colony. So New York. New York's history is a little bit different. Obviously, it has other competitive cities from the beginning. But it also had certain advantages, and as finance capital became more important, it again becomes kind of the center for that in the United States. Its population, you'll see here, grows again quite rapidly. From the early part of the 19th century to the very end, 4.2 million people in 1900. This was an interesting little bit here about Peter Stuyvesant and why we have Wall Street. It literally was a wall that was put up to protect the people of the time in their early trade. So why New York? Geography. Again, being a port is really important. Transportation costs, the scale economies, immigration, cheap labor. But it also starts to grow out of its kind of early manufacturing history to become the site of the financial industries. Like London, New York also benefits from the ideology of emergent capitalism. And particularly as I tell my class in political sociology, that if there's any country actually adopted notions of John Locke, it's the United States. The kind of expansionist notion that you go out there and whatever you appropriate from the land belongs to you was very fitting in terms of westward expansion of the United States. Westward expansion needed financing, and New York was able to actually offer this. But as the United States, by the end of the 19th century, has now conquered its internal markets, it's now beginning to kind of fashion its own processes. It's at this point, albeit at first reluctantly, that the United States also becomes a global empire. And so particularly in the era of President McKinley, this is when the United States begins to acquire various kinds of colonies, and it expands outwards from there. And again, this is to the advantage of finance capital, which is always looking for markets to expand into. So again, why New York over London and the UK necessarily? Just quickly find this here. So why did the United States replace Britain at the head of the capitalist table? First, the United States' vast resources and burgeoning population made it a growing industrial power. Second, its geographic location, even isolation, far from the seemingly endless troubles affecting Europe and Asia, and military might, exemplified in the war with Spain, made it the obvious successor to Britain as the world's policeman and protector of capital. But third, we must also consider the role of elite cultural affinity. Beginning especially in the late 19th century, as the United States grew in power, notions of an Anglo-Saxon race spreading over time and space from India to Germany to Britain and now to the Americas took hold among the American and British elite. Financiers, aristocrats, writers, and politicians spoke of a bond bred of cultural and racial superiority found in the values and political institutions among English-speaking peoples. These imagined notions of superiority and of imperial destiny were nurtured through business and personal connections, including marriage, while also solidifying, if not confirming, elite fears of threat to their wealth and status. Hence the need for a safe haven, as the United States and New York offered. By the turn of the century, New York and was the clear financial center of the United States. Historically, American financiers, despite occasional scandals, had been more conservative than their freewheeling and creative British counterparts. This began to change, however, in the years immediately after the First World War, leading to rampant speculation that found its apogee in the years leading up to 1929. The Great Depression was sobering, the Second World War that followed more so. The end of war saw the United States take on the fallen mantle of the British Empire as the chief protector of global capitalism, as an especially important role in the subsequent Cold War context of the communist threat. Within this broader role, the United States also played an important part in rebuilding and stabilizing the world economy. This was achieved primarily through the Bretton Woods system. The system established at the end of the Second World War was the product largely of John Maynard Keynes, a British economist and director of the Bank of England. It balanced the interests of finance, money capital, and industrial capital through a system of international monetary exchanges, capital based on the American dollar, overseen by the US-led International Monetary Fund and World Bank. Given their obvious political importance in the post-war world, Washington was made the headquarters of both these institutions. Bretton Woods lasted roughly 25 years. Ironically, when it collapsed, it did so as much at the hand of American finance capitalists, though certainly not this class alone. The early post-war years provided ample opportunities for finance capitalists to make a profit, but the Keynesian welfare state that had emerged put restraints on capital, finance capital in particular, in the name of the domestic economy and national interests. By the early 1960s, finance capitalists, headquartered within the major global cities, were bridling at the regulatory restraints and costs imposed upon it by this system. International by its nature, finance capital, housed in the major banking institutions in London, New York, and elsewhere, finally gained the upper hand in the early 1970s when a series of technological, sociological, and ideological revolutions, combined with the OPEC crisis and the onset of stagflation throughout the Western world, unraveled the Keynesian compromise. The period of neo-globalization that ensued freed up finance capital for expansion, breaking up in many instances the national states in which it had previously been embedded, while simultaneously giving rise to new city-states, the global cities, able to provide services directly to the global economy. Quote from Hobsbawm there. But the new imperialism that emerged was not like the old imperialism. Previous empires had relied on direct power or the collaboration of local elites. By contrast, the new informal type of empire practiced by the U.S., though still capable when needing to exercise force, imposed its will in hegemonic fashion through institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, and after the 1980s, through a series of trade agreements that expanded the reach of finance capital. Unrestrained, however, finance capital soon found itself the victim of overreach. In some other writings I've done, I've actually talked about three period stages of neoliberal globalization. One being ascendancy from the 1970s and 80s. This is kind of the period you think of Margaret Thatcher elected in 1979, Ronald Reagan in 1980. Process of kind of expanding free trade agreements, Canada being really the first test case, and it becoming the, as was argued at the time, if you can't have free trade with the United States with Canada, then it's a dead deal anywhere, so Canada's got to be the first one. And then from there, of course, NAFTA, but a whole series of other agreements, of which there's been some again signed just in the last while. But after, and then so finally into the 1990s, a period of triumph. End of the, well, you know, people talk about now the Cold War coming back again, perhaps. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and an alternative model, and so there's a kind of hubris at this point that, as Fukuyama talks about, the end of history, that, you know, we know the future from here on in, liberal capitalism, except that all of a sudden by 1997 you have the start of a lot of economic upheavals. And really since that time, and most particularly throughout the 2000s, you have a series of financial crises that have been occurring with increasing intensity, but even more frequently. So if it used to be the rule of thumb, kind of the old curves talked about a big crisis every 35 to 40 years. Well, they seem to be coming now about every 3, 4, 5 years. But also as a process of globalization, of course, there is no safe haven any longer. So it used to be in the Great Depression in the 1930s actually didn't affect a large portion of the world, because if you're not involved with capital markets, if you don't have labor markets, you can't be affected by it. Newfoundland actually in this country virtually didn't experience the Depression. It was poor before, it was poor during, it was poor afterwards, but the Depression had almost no effect on it. And so you had, but there's no escape from that now. Globalization means that, you know, as they say, when someone sneezes one place, someone else gets a cold in another, right? And it happens really rapidly. But a large part of this is, again, the spread of finance capital. It's really finance capital that, as we saw in the crisis that began back in 97, 98 in Thailand, when the Thai baht suddenly collapses, and overnight virtually the crisis goes from Thailand to Malaysia to Russia and suddenly over to Brazil. And it's because money can be transferred so rapidly. So the technological changes and the mobility of finance capital, as opposed to actually moving a real factory, increases the instability. And as Radis has said, though, it's not so much that finance capital has actually left the real economy. So as some people talk about, there's the real economy here and it's suffering, and then there's finance capital here. It's more that finance capital actually now has integrated itself into the real economy in ways that is actually kind of problematic. These are just a few numbers that pulled out here just to give you some sense of this. So during the 2000s, even as the crises start to grow, at the same time, finance capital itself continues to grow, and it's being pushed by governments in various ways. And you see here that the amount of capital flows during, as Hogarth and others have suggested, increased from 5% to 17% of the world's GDP during this period of time. And again, adds to the possibilities of instability there. And this figure here, I think, is really interesting. So the global GDP in 2010, this is from a in-depth study that Der Spiegel did, actually. It was really fascinating. The entire global GDP was 63 trillion US, but the value of shares and bonds traded was 87 trillion, and the off-exchange trading of derivatives, we know that name everybody became familiar with that after 2007, was 601 trillion. And the total value of currency exchange transactions was $955 trillion. So if you think that, in some sense, if you equate the global GDP of 63 trillion as being kind of this is what's really done versus what is fictitious, then you can see there's a problem here, and eventually, you know, the crunch is going to come. Someone is going to call in the chits, and so anyway, so back to London and New York, because again this is a globalized system, but where do New York and London fit within this? Really interesting thing here is that, and again I'll just refer back to my notes briefly here. No, I won't bother actually. London and New York aren't actually the largest cities in the by population. Lots of bigger cities by population, but this simply means again that when you think about cities and global cities, don't think about the population and where people live is different from the financial districts again. That's the point here, is that the city or Wall Street is a small part but an important part, but in some sense it's not where people live. So there might be 30 million people there, but they may never have a real connection with Wall Street or the city. In fact, the number of people who actually work in the city of London is something like 8,000 people, right? It's just a place where people go and then they work there and they leave. Nobody really actually lives in that place. They're not even the wealthiest places in terms of GDP, and apparently, back to the notion of actually having good hockey teams or something, it's not even where most billionaires love to live, but it's where a lot of really important stuff happens. They head up these indexes, and presumably they're going to remain at the head of these indexes for some period of time. To conclude, there's really three things here that I think are really important. Here I will refer back to the conclusion I've written. What I've examined here is the specificity of London and New York at the apex of global cities. It is argued that their prominence is due primarily to their financial districts, the city and Wall Street, and their role in coordinating the flow of finance capital within the global economy. Examining the historical development of London and New York tells us much about how finance capital has come to dominate the global economy. But it also raises questions about the importance of ethnocultural affinity in shaping economic relations, the role of historical contingency in global financial systems, that is, getting in first and then remaining in a prominent position, and the limits of liberal democracy within a liberal economic system. Will the city and Wall Street remain at the center of finance capital? Globalization's current epoch has resulted in a real transfer of productive forces and wealth from the industrialized North to the undeveloped South. This would suggest challenges to London and New York in future. Yet countering this, the McKinsey Global Institute in 2013 argued that while the center of gravity of the urban world will move south and east, primarily to China, that is Beijing, New York will continue through 2025 to have the highest GDP, while though London will slip only marginally to fourth place behind Tokyo and Shanghai. So it'll still be up there as a prominent place. But we may also consider a third option. As Marx once averred, that finance capital will continue to grow beyond the precincts of the city and of Wall Street, or of any other global city, nestling and settling everywhere, an abstraction that once confronted, as the Occupy movement has discovered, melts into air. I'm done. Lots of time.